The blood on the snow was the first thing you'd notice. A splash of crimson on a perfect white canvas. The kind of stain that never really washes out. The man who lay there, half buried and freezing, had managed to whisper just 4 words before the light left his eyes. The girl knows everything. 100 miles away, Major Lionel Hargrove woke up with a gasp, the sheets of his bed soaked in sweat. It wasn't the December cold that chilled him. It was the dream. Always the same dream. His men, his boys, dying in a German forest, their faces twisted in betrayal. Men he'd sworn he would bring home. He'd broken that promise, and it had broken him. The wind howled outside his isolated Montana cabin. To most people, it was just wind. To Lionel, it sounded like incoming artillery, a sound that made the scars on his soul ache. He reached under his pillow, his fingers finding the cold, familiar steel of his M1911. A habit he couldn't shake. 2 years he'd been hiding in these mountains. 2 years since the war ended and he'd come home to a world that didn't make sense anymore. Or maybe he was the one who didn't make sense. The locals in the nearest town, Eagle Valley, they had a name for him. The Ghost. They saw a man who built a cabin with his bare hands in the middle of nowhere, a man who only came to town when his supplies ran dangerously low. Some whispered he was a deserter. Others said he was a war hero who'd lost his mind. The truth was somewhere in the messy middle. He was a man who had lost his wife, his son, everything he'd ever fought for. He was a man who hadn't found the courage to die. He got up and moved to the stove, his body still lean and hard from years of soldiering. Scars crisscrossed his chest like a road map of hell. He set a pot of coffee to boil, his eyes drifting to a loose floorboard under his bed. Beneath it was a wooden box, and in that box were the ghosts of his past, his wife's letters, his son's birth certificate, and the classified orders for his last mission. Operation Snowfall. The mission that had gone so wrong. The mission that had killed his men and sent him running to the edge of the world. Dawn was breaking, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gray and pink. Another day of the same routine. Check the traps, split wood, and try not to think. But this morning, something was different. The air was too still. The silence was too loud. 20 years as a soldier had sharpened his instincts into a razor's edge. And right now, that razor was screaming a warning. He grabbed his rifle, the weight of it a grim comfort, and stepped outside. The cold bit at his face, sharp and clean. He scanned the tree line, his eyes missing nothing. A branch heavy with snow, a raven taking flight, and then he saw it. Footprints, not his own, faint, almost invisible, but they were there. Someone had been circling his cabin during the night, someone who knew how to move like a shadow. This wasn't a lost hiker. This was a professional. This was a hunter. And Lionel knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was the prey. He'd thought he could just disappear. He'd thought the world would forget about him. He was wrong. He followed the tracks, his every sense on high alert. The man had worn military-style boots, but not standard issue. The stride was long, confident. This was someone who was used to tracking, used to hunting men in the wild. Lionel's mind raced. Who could it be? The OSS was gone, but its secrets, its enemies, they lived on. He was halfway through his trapline when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the deep woods. A whimper. So faint, it was almost carried away by the wind. He froze, listening. There it was again. A child's cry. He moved toward the sound, silent as the falling snow. And what he found would shatter the fragile peace he had built for himself. There, huddled at the base of a massive pine tree, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 12. Her clothes were expensive, but torn and stained with blood. Her face was pale, her lips blue with cold, but her eyes were wide with a terror that Lionel knew all too well. When she saw him, she tried to scramble away. "Are you one of them?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Did you come to kill me, like you killed my father?" Lionel lowered his rifle, holding up an empty hand. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice low and calm. But his mind was anything but calm. A little girl, wounded and alone, miles from anywhere. It made no sense. He saw the makeshift bandage on her thigh, soaked through with blood. "You're bleeding badly," he said. "If you don't get warm, you're going to die out here." Fear warred with desperation in her eyes. Finally, she gave a small, shaky nod. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a fragile bundle of bones and fever. "What's your name?" he asked, carrying her back toward the cabin. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Blackwood." The name was unfamiliar, but as he carried her through the deepening snow, she murmured something else, something that made his blood run cold. "Project Frost," she mumbled, her head lolling against his shoulder. Dad said, "Find Ghost in Montana." Ghost, his old OSS call sign, a name that was supposed to have died with his men in that German forest. This wasn't a random accident. This girl, Sarah Blackwood, hadn't just stumbled upon his cabin. She had been looking for him, and she had brought the war right back to his doorstep. He got her inside, laid her on his bed, and went to work. The skills he'd learned on the battlefield, patching up dying soldiers, came rushing back. Hypothermia, dehydration, and the leg wound. It was a gunshot, not an accident. Someone had tried to kill this child. As he cleaned the wound, he noticed other marks. Burns on her palm, bruises on her wrists. This wasn't just an attempted murder. This was torture. He worked silently, efficiently, pushing back the memories of field hospitals and dying men. This wasn't the same. This was just a girl. He would fix her up, take her to the authorities, and go back to being a ghost. No entanglements, no complications. But then Sarah stirred, her eyes flying open, wide with fever and fear. "They'll come for me," she gasped. "They always come." "Who?" Lionel asked, but he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. Sarah's eyes locked onto his. "Are you him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you really Ghost?" Before he could answer, a new sound cut through the howling wind, the sound of an engine. A heavy-duty vehicle, grinding its way up the impassable logging trail. Chains on its tires, chewing through the deep snow. It was impossible, unless you had military equipment, and a very, very good reason to be out in a blizzard. "They found me," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with a terrifying certainty. She tried to get up, to run, but Lionel gently pushed her back down. "You're not going anywhere on that leg," he said, grabbing his rifle. "Stay here, and don't make a sound." As he moved toward the door, Sarah grabbed his sleeve. Her hand was small, but her grip was surprisingly strong. She pressed something into his palm, something cold and heavy. It was a bullet, a tarnished silver bullet with strange markings on the casing. "Dad said to give you this," she said. "He said you'd understand." Lionel stared at it, and the world tilted on its axis. It wasn't just any bullet. It was from a special batch made for his OSS team, traceable to only 5 men. 4 were dead. He was the 5th. "Your father," he said, his voice a low growl. "What was his name?" "Dr. Richard Blackwood," she replied. "He worked for the government after the war. Project Paperclip. He said if anything happened, I should find Ghost. He said Ghost would keep me safe." Blackwood, the British scientist who'd been with them in the final days of the war. The man who had tried to warn them about Operation Snowfall. The man who knew the truth. The engine noise was louder now, closer. Whoever was in that Jeep, they weren't trying to be quiet. They were sending a message. "Get under the bed," Lionel ordered Sarah. "There's a loose floorboard. If this goes bad, you take the box you find there and you run. Head for the creek. Stay in the water. Don't stop." She nodded, her young face a mask of grim determination. Through the swirling snow, he saw it. A military-style Jeep, unmarked, the kind used for operations that don't officially exist. 2 men got out. They were dressed like civilians, but they moved like soldiers. Or something worse. They moved with the cold efficiency of men who kill for a living. The man in front raised a hand to knock. His other hand rested on the butt of a gun tucked into his coat. "Mr. Hargrove," he called out. "We need to talk to you. We're looking for a missing girl." They knew she was here. They had tracked her through a blizzard to his front door. And they were lying. It was the smooth, practiced lie of men who are just following orders. Lionel could kill them both before they took another breath. But there would be others. There were always others. He had sworn off killing. But what about protecting? What about a promise made to a dead friend? He made a decision. He put down his rifle, walked to the door, and opened it. He stood there, unarmed, a man who just wanted to be left alone. "I'm Hargrove," he said. "What girl?" The man, who introduced himself as Miller from Crawford Mining Corporation, gave a friendly, practiced smile. It didn't reach his eyes. He said Sarah was the daughter of an executive, that she'd run away after a tragic accident involving her father. He said she was confused, delusional. He offered a $5,000 reward, a fortune in those days. Too much for a simple runaway. Lionel's blood ran cold at the name. Crawford, Colonel Robert Crawford, the man who had sent his team into an ambush, the man who had left them to die. "Haven't seen anyone," Lionel said, his voice flat. "Been snowed in for days." Miller's smile tightened. "Mind if we take a look, for our own peace of mind?" It wasn't a request. Behind him, the second man was circling to the back of the cabin, cutting off any escape. "That's a lot of money for a runaway," Lionel observed. "She's very important to Mr. Crawford," Miller said. Then he leaned in, his voice dropping. "She's been saying some disturbing things. That her father was murdered. That people are trying to hurt her. It's the trauma, you see. For her own safety, it's best not to indulge these fantasies." He handed Lionel a business card, and in that moment, Lionel knew. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a hunting party, and Sarah was the prize. He watched them drive away, the tension in his shoulders so tight it was a physical pain. They didn't believe him. They'd be back, and next time, they wouldn't knock. He bolted the door and turned to the bed. "They're gone. For now." Sarah crawled out, her face pale. "You didn't believe them, did you?" "They killed him," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "My father. They drowned him and made it look like an accident. And they were going to do the same to me." Lionel looked at the silver bullet in his hand. Proof. A tangible link to the past he could no longer outrun. "Your father," he said. "What did he tell you about me? About Project Frost?" She took a deep breath. "He said you were the only one who survived Operation Snowfall. He said you knew the truth. That you were a man of honor. That you wouldn't let them get away with it." The weight of those words settled on him, heavier than any rucksack he'd ever carried. Project Frost. It wasn't just scientists we brought back from Germany, was it? "No," Sarah whispered, her eyes dark with a horror no child should ever know. "It was their weapons, terrible weapons, and they're still working on them, testing them, on people who won't be missed." Lionel closed his eyes, and he was back in that German lab, the smell of disinfectant and death. The files detailing experiments that defied humanity. They had been ordered to destroy everything. But what if they had failed? What if a piece of that evil had followed them home? The storm raged for 3 days, trapping them in the cabin. A fragile, temporary peace. Lionel tended to Sarah's wounds. Her leg was healing, but the real wounds, the ones on the inside, would take much longer. She told him everything. Her father, Dr. Blackwood, had been recruited to continue the research from Germany. He thought he was working on defenses, on vaccines, but he slowly uncovered the truth. Project Frost wasn't a defense. It was a weapon of terrifying precision, a biological agent that could target and eliminate specific genetic groups, the ultimate tool of genocide. And Colonel Crawford, now a powerful civilian contractor, was in charge of it all. He was running the project from a secret facility, hidden deep underground, disguised as a mining operation. He was using people from the local towns as his test subjects. People who were poor, who were marginalized, who wouldn't be missed. My father found the proof, Sarah said, her voice low. He copied files. He was going to expose them. But they found out. She pulled a waterproof pouch from her tattered rucksack. It was filled with documents, lab reports, test results, and a small metal case. Samples, she said. Dad said you'd know what to do with them. He looked at the papers, his hands shaking slightly. The technical jargon, the cold, clinical descriptions of human suffering. It was all there. Crawford had not only continued the Nazi research, he had perfected it. Why me? Lionel asked. Why not the FBI? The newspapers? Because you're presumed dead, Sarah said simply. Crawford thinks you died with the rest of your team. He arranged the ambush, you know. Your team saw too much. You weren't supposed to survive. The betrayal was a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He had suspected it for years, but hearing it confirmed, it changed everything. The men who died in that forest weren't casualties of war. They were victims of a murder, an execution, and he was the last witness. The storm finally broke on the fourth day. The world outside was silent, buried under a thick blanket of fresh snow. They'll be back soon, Lionel said. We have to move. They packed what little they had: food, medical supplies, ammunition. As they were about to leave, Lionel stopped her. If something happens to me, he said, you go to Eagles Point. Find a doctor named Sullivan. Tell him Ghost sent you. Can you do that? She nodded, her small face serious. I won't let you down. They moved down the mountain, avoiding the main trails, sticking to the deep woods. Lionel set a hard pace. By midday, they were miles from the cabin. They paused to rest, and Lionel scanned the valley below. Then he heard it. The faint sound of engines. 2 jeeps, crawling up the road they had just left behind. 6 men, heavily armed. They know we're gone, he whispered. They're tracking us. He grabbed Sarah's rucksack, his mind racing. The storm had covered their tracks. How could they know? He dumped the contents onto the snow, searching, feeling. And then he found it. A small metallic disc, no bigger than a dime, sewn into the lining. A tracking device. Military grade. They've been following you since you escaped, he said, crushing it under his boot. Fear flashed in Sarah's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a cold fury. Which means, she said, her voice catching on, they know where we're going. He had planned to head straight for Eagles Point, for Dr. Sullivan. But that was a trap now. They had to change course, disappear again. But as he looked at Sarah, at her injured leg, he knew they couldn't keep running forever. They had to fight back. The plan had been to hide. The plan had been to survive. But the plan had just changed. Now, the plan was to hunt. A new snow began to fall, soft flakes drifting down through the pines. A gift. It would cover their new tracks, buy them some time. As they pushed deeper into the woods, heading for an old, abandoned trapper's cabin he knew of, the silence was broken by the sharp crack of a rifle. Instinct took over. Lionel tackled Sarah, throwing them both behind a fallen log as a bullet ripped through the space where her head had been. Bark exploded from a nearby tree. Sniper. A professional. Another shot kicked up snow just inches from their hiding place. He had a thermal scope. He could see them, even through the trees, even in the falling snow. When I give the signal, you run, Lionel hissed, his mind a cold, clear machine of tactical calculations. Head northwest. The trapper's cabin is 2 miles that way. Don't stop. Don't look back. But what about you? She whispered, her eyes wide with terror. I'll draw his fire, he said. He gave her a final hard look. Go! He burst from behind the log, firing his revolver toward the ridge where the shots were coming from. Not aiming to hit, just to make noise, to draw attention. Sarah scrambled to her feet and ran, disappearing into the white curtain of the snowstorm. The sniper's next shot was closer, and Lionel felt a searing pain as a bullet grazed his shoulder. He spun, using the momentum to dive behind another tree. He was bleeding, but it wasn't a fatal wound. He could still fight. He reloaded, his hands moving with practiced speed. 5 shots left. He had to make them count. He moved from tree to tree, a ghost in the snow, circling, flanking, turning the hunter into the hunted. Through a gap in the trees, he saw him. A tall man in tactical gear, moving with the easy confidence of a predator. Lionel waited. Let him get closer. 30 yards. 20. Then Lionel stepped out from behind a tree. "That's close enough," he called out. The man froze, his rifle half raised, and as he looked at Lionel, his eyes widened in shock. "Major Hargrove," he said, his voice a disbelieving whisper, "you're supposed to be dead." Lionel stared back. The face was older, harder, but he knew it. It was a ghost from his own past. "Lieutenant Hayes," he said. "Andrew Hayes. You're working for Crawford." Hayes, who had been transferred out of his unit just weeks before the ambush. Hayes, who should have been one of the good guys. "I have orders, Major," Hayes said, his rifle still trained on Lionel's chest. "Bring in the girl." "She's gone," Lionel said. "National security is at stake," Hayes said, the words sounding hollow, rehearsed. "Is that what Crawford told you? Or did he tell you about Project Frost? About the human experiments? About the weapon he's building?" Doubt flickered in Hayes's eyes. Just a flicker, but it was there. "The girl has proof, Hayes. Documents. Evidence. Her father was a good man, a scientist who tried to do the right thing. And Crawford had him murdered." Snow fell between them, a silent, swirling curtain. "Why should I believe you?" Hayes asked, his voice strained. "Because you served under me," Lionel said, his voice low and intense. "You know me. Did I ever lie to you? Did I ever leave a man behind?" The question hung in the frigid air, a test of loyalty, of memory, of honor. Hayes's rifle wavered. "I need time," he said, "to verify." "You have 24 hours," Lionel shot back. "After that, we're gone and the documents go public. One way or another, this is coming out." Hayes made a decision. He lowered his rifle. 24 hours, he agreed. Eagles Point, the Silver Dollar Saloon, tomorrow night. He turned to leave, then paused. "Be careful, Major. The doctor in town, Sullivan? He's been asking too many questions. Crawford has him on a watch list." And with that, he was gone, melting back into the snow. Lionel stood there, his shoulder burning, his mind reeling. Had he just made a deal with the devil? Or had he found an unlikely ally? He didn't know. But he knew one thing. He had to find Sarah. He had to get to that trapper's cabin, and he had to pray that she had made it there alive. He found her huddled by the cold hearth of the old cabin, shivering, but safe. The relief was so intense it almost buckled his knees. "I thought you were dead," she whispered, her eyes wide as she saw the blood on his shoulder. "Not yet," he said, his voice rough. They built a small, smokeless fire. He cleaned and bandaged his wound. They were safe for now, but the clock was ticking. 24 hours. "Can we trust him?" Sarah asked. "Trust is a luxury," Lionel replied, "but we have the documents. He knows if anything happens to us, the whole world finds out what Crawford is doing." They made a plan. They would head to Eagles Point. They would find Dr. Sullivan, and Lionel would meet with Hayes. It was a gamble, a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. The next night, they slipped into the outskirts of Eagles Point under the cover of darkness. The town had changed. It was bigger, busier. Crawford's mining company had brought a false prosperity, a creeping sickness that Lionel could feel in the air. He left Sarah hidden in a copse of trees and circled the doctor's clinic. It was quiet, too quiet. He knocked on the back door, a coded signal. The door opened, and a weary, aged face peered out. Dr. Sullivan. He looked older, more tired than Lionel remembered. "My God," the doctor breathed. "Hargrove, you're supposed to be dead." "It's a persistent rumor," Lionel said. "We need your help." Sullivan brought them inside, his movements quick and efficient. He treated Sarah's leg, his old hands surprisingly steady. "I've been seeing things," the doctor said, his voice low. "Strange illnesses, People disappearing. I've been documenting it, but without proof. We have proof, Lionel said. He showed him the documents. The doctor's face went pale as he read. This is monstrous, he whispered. This needs to go to the authorities. Crawford has the authorities in his pocket, Lionel said. We need to go public. A journalist, someone who can't be bought. Jack Reynolds, Sullivan said immediately, at the Rocky Mountain Tribune. He's been investigating Crawford for months. A new plan began to form, a path forward. But first, Lionel had to meet with Hayes. It was a risk, he knew. But he had to know where the lieutenant stood. He left Sarah with Sullivan in the relative safety of the clinic. Be careful, she whispered, giving him a fierce, unexpected hug. I will, he promised. The Silver Dollar Saloon was loud and crowded, filled with miners and company men, an island of forced cheer in a town drowning in secrets. Hayes was already there, at a corner table. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said. What did you find? Lionel asked, cutting straight to the point. Hayes leaned forward. Enough, he said. The facility on the mountain is a fortress. Restricted areas, armed guards, and the disappearances, 17 people in the last 6 months. Officially, they were relocated. Unofficially, they vanished. He paused. I mentioned your name to Crawford. He almost had a heart attack. He's scared, Major. He's accelerating something called Phase 3. The pieces were falling into place, but it wasn't enough. I need more than suspicions, Hayes. I need to know whose side you're on. Show me the documents, Hayes countered. The real ones. I need to be sure before I burn my entire life to the ground. It was a standoff. A game of trust between two men who had been trained to trust no one. Lionel made a decision. He slid a single page of Blackwood's notes across the table. A report on Test Subject 37. A human being, reduced to a set of data points. As Hayes read it, the color drained from his face. This is inhuman, he whispered. And there's 100 more pages just like it, Lionel said. Hayes looked up, his eyes filled with a new, cold resolve. What do you need? Information, Lionel said. Security protocols, a vehicle, a way to get to Reynolds in Helena. I can do that, Hayes said. But I need 48 hours. I have an inspection tomorrow. I can get what you need without raising suspicion. It was a risk. Another delay. But the intelligence could be vital. 48 hours, Lionel agreed. Meet me at Sullivan's hunting cabin. And come alone. As Hayes left, Lionel felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But it was a fragile, dangerous thing, and it was about to be extinguished. A commotion at the bar drew his attention. A woman, impeccably dressed, with a sharp British accent, was being confronted by a distraught young miner. My brother went to your facility for treatment 3 weeks ago, the miner slurred, and now he's gone. The woman, who introduced herself as Claire Thompson, the director of community relations for Crawford Mining, handled the situation with a cold, corporate calm. But as her eyes swept the room, they locked with Lionel's. There was no recognition, but there was assessment. The look of a professional sizing up a threat. She made her way toward him. I don't believe we've met, she said, her smile polished and empty. He gave her a fake name, a cover story, but she saw right through it. Her gaze lingered on his shoulder, where his wound was hidden. You have the look of a man accustomed to challenges, she said. The conversation was a chess match, each word a carefully calculated move. She knew. He didn't know how, but she knew who he was. As she left, she wished him a pleasant journey to Helena. A warning. A threat. He left the saloon, a cold dread settling in his gut. He was halfway back to the woods when a voice called out from the darkness. Major Hargrove, don't shoot! It was her, Claire Thompson. Hayes reported your meeting the second he left the saloon, she said, her voice urgent. He's been Crawford's most loyal man for years. He helped set up the ambush that killed your team. It's a trap, Major. They know where Sullivan's cabin is. They're moving in tonight. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow. Hayes had been playing him all along. Why are you telling me this? Lionel demanded, his gun leveled at her chest. Because Richard Blackwood was my friend, she said, her voice cracking for the first time. And because Crawford is insane. He's moving to Phase 3. He's going to release Project Frost on Eagles Point in 72 hours. A field test. The horror of it was unimaginable. An entire town sacrificed. "We have to get Sarah," Lionel said, his mind racing. "Sullivan's cabin isn't safe. I can take you to another shelter," Thompson offered. But as they crested a ridge overlooking the valley, they saw it. Dark figures moving through the trees, surrounding the small hunting cabin, a full tactical team. They were too late. And then, the night exploded. Gunfire erupted from all sides, pouring into the small cabin. But then, to Lionel's astonishment, there was return fire. A single rifle, firing with deadly accuracy. Sullivan. The old doctor was fighting back. But it was hopeless. One man against a dozen. "We have to do something," Lionel said, starting down the ridge. "It's suicide," Thompson warned. But before he could take another step, the cabin itself detonated in a massive fireball, an explosion so powerful it shook the ground beneath their feet. The building collapsed into a roaring inferno. No one could have survived that. Sullivan. And Sarah. She was gone. He had failed. The promise he had made to her father, to himself. It was all just ash and smoke. "The documents," Thompson said, her voice sharp, pulling him back from the edge. "Did she have them with her?" "No," he managed to say, his voice hollow. "They're hidden." "Then it wasn't for nothing," she said. "We can still stop him. We can still make him pay." A cold, terrible calm settled over Lionel. The grief was a fire in his chest, burning away the last vestiges of the man he used to be. The ghost had been running. The ghost had been hiding. But now, the ghost was hunting, and he would have his vengeance. Thompson led him to an old, abandoned mining shaft, a relic from the Prohibition era, now her private safe house. It was stocked, defensible, and completely off the grid. As she treated his shoulder again, she told him her story. She too had worked for British intelligence. She too had been drawn into Crawford's orbit. And she too had been trapped. "He has my daughter," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "In London. He uses her to control me." The pieces of the puzzle were ugly, but they were starting to fit. They spent the next hours poring over schematics of the facility that Thompson had secretly copied. It was a fortress, but every fortress had a weakness. Theirs was the midnight shift change, a 12-minute window of vulnerability. They had a plan, a desperate, almost suicidal plan. They would infiltrate the facility, plant explosives, and destroy Project Frost before it could be unleashed. First, they had to retrieve the documents. Sarah had hidden them in a hollow tree near Sullivan's clinic, a dead drop, a lesson from her spy-in-training father. They slipped back into Eagles Point, now under a full lockdown by Crawford's men. They moved like shadows, ghosts in their own story, and retrieved the pouch. The proof was back in their hands. Now, for the final act. They reached the facility's perimeter just before midnight. The shift change was their only chance. Thompson used a key card on a maintenance door. It flashed red. Denied. "They've changed the codes," she hissed. "Crawford's locked everything down." The window was closing. Security would be back on full alert in minutes. "We need a diversion," Lionel said. He pointed to the fuel storage tanks on the far side of the compound. "Trigger the alarms there. I'll go in through the ventilation system." It was a long shot, but it was all they had. The alarms blared, and security teams scrambled toward the fuel depot. Lionel pried open a vent cover and slipped inside the facility's metallic guts. He crawled through claustrophobic tunnels, the schematics burned into his memory, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest. He found the access point to the main laboratory. Through the grate he could see it, the heart of the beast. Containment units, computer terminals, the machinery of genocide. He dropped into the lab, silent as a whisper, and went to work. He copied the final damning pieces of data from the central computer. He planted the explosive charges. He was setting the timers when the door slid open. It was Hayes. "I wondered if you'd make it," he said, his gun steady, his face unreadable. He was followed moments later by Crawford himself, flanked by guards. The trap had been sprung. "The ghost returns," Crawford said, a thin, cruel smile on his face. "How very predictable." He circled Lionel like a shark. "It's over. Thompson has been captured. Her little girl will be so disappointed. And the Blackwood child. A regrettable casualty. But you, Major, you have information I want." Hayes stepped forward, handcuffs ready, hands behind your back. It was over. He had failed. But as Hayes got close, he leaned in and whispered, so low only Lionel could hear. "Storage closet. 3 minutes." It was a trick. It had to be. But as Hayes cuffed him, he deliberately missed the detonator in Lionel's pocket. He was marched out of the lab, down a service corridor. Hayes ordered the guards to wait outside a storage closet. Inside, he unlocked Lionel's cuffs. "The camera loop resets in 3 minutes," he said, handing Lionel his gun. "Crawford is deploying Phase 3 at dawn. 6 hours from now, he's going to poison the town." "Why are you helping me?" Lionel demanded. "I've been playing a long game," Hayes said, "waiting for the right moment to take him down. I needed your proof to make it stick." He paused, his face grim. "And there's something else. Sarah, she wasn't in the cabin." The world stopped. "What?" "Sullivan got her out," Hayes said quickly. "Through a tunnel. He sent her to an old friend, a Blackfoot elder named Eagle Shield. She's alive, Major. She's in a place called Spirit Canyon." Hope, fierce and blinding, surged through Lionel. Sarah was alive. There was no time. They had to move. "The lab explosives won't stop the deployment," Hayes said. "The delivery system is in sub-level 1. We have to split up." "If this is a trick," Lionel started. "We both die," Hayes finished. "Good luck, Major." Lionel scrambled into a maintenance tunnel. The facility alarm screamed to life. Hayes must have been discovered. Lionel didn't hesitate. He hit the detonator. A deep, rolling explosion shook the building. The lab, the research, the samples. It was all gone. He fought his way through the chaos to the emergency exit. Hayes wasn't there. He was gone. Captured or killed, he had bought Lionel the time he needed. He ran. He ran into the darkness, into the frozen wilderness, with a single burning purpose: find Sarah. He journeyed for what felt like an eternity, wounded, exhausted, but driven by a force more powerful than pain. He found the entrance to Spirit Canyon. He was met by Blackfoot warriors, men who guarded their sacred land with quiet, deadly resolve. He told them who he was looking for, and they led him to their elder, Samuel Eagle Shield. "Dr. Sullivan told me you would come," the old man said, his eyes filled with a deep, ancient wisdom. He led Lionel to a small cabin, and there she was, safe, alive. She ran to him, her small arms wrapping around him in a desperate hug. "You came back," she cried. "I knew you would." He held her tight, the cold, frozen block of his heart finally, painfully beginning to thaw. The documents were safe. The research was destroyed, but Crawford was still out there. "What now?" Sarah asked, her eyes, so much like her father's, looking to him for answers. "Now," Lionel said, his voice filled with a certainty that surprised him. "We finish this. We take the truth to the world. And we make him pay." They had a long journey ahead, a path fraught with danger. But for the first time in a very long time, Lionel Hargrove wasn't running from his ghosts. He was leading the way. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a keeper, a guardian, a protector, and he would not fail again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. You never know what secrets are buried just beneath the surface.